Every evening in the Baker household in Yale, Oklahoma, the same thing happened. Chesney Senior came home, sat at the kitchen table, and after a while picked up the guitar that lived in the corner of the room. He played alone, without audience, and without apparent purpose, following something that had no name and required none. The music was neither happy nor sad. It was simply present, the way weather was present, the way the particular quality of light in the Oklahoma evenings was present. Chesney Baker sat in the next room and listened. He was 5 years old, then 7, then 10, and the guitar was always there, and his father was always somewhere else even when he was in the room, and the music was the only thing that traveled reliably between them. When Baker picked up a trumpet at 13 and began to play, he was asked years later what had made him want to. He thought about it for a long moment, then he said, "I don't know. It was just there." Yale, Oklahoma in the 1930s was not a place that offered many explanations for the things that happened inside its houses. The Depression had produced a particular quality of daily life in small Midwestern towns, a contracted practical existence in which the primary concerns were material, and the interior life was managed privately, without the vocabulary or the occasion for its public expression. People worked, struggled, endured, and did not generally discuss the nature of their endurance. The Baker household was, in this respect, entirely representative of its time and place. The town itself offered the specific combination of intimacy and loneliness that small American towns produce, everyone knowing everyone else's circumstances without anyone knowing anyone else's interior. You knew your neighbors' financial situations, their family compositions, their patterns of behavior, the things that happened in their houses as observed from the outside. You did not know, and were not expected to know, what any of it felt like from the inside. This was not coldness. The town was not cold. It was the practical privacy of people who had enough difficulty managing their own interiors without taking on anyone else's. Chesney Senior had come to Yale the way most men came to small Oklahoma towns in that period, through the combination of limited options and the presence of someone he had married. He worked irregularly in whatever employment the local economy made available, which in the late 1930s was not consistent work but was sufficient, in combination with Vera Baker's steadier income from domestic work for two of the town's more prosperous families, to maintain a household that was poor without being desperate. He was not a violent man, which was notable in a context where alcohol and frustration could produce violence, and he was not a cruel man, which was also notable. He was simply absent in the ways that mattered while present in the ways that did not require anything from him. The guitar was the exception. It was an old acoustic instrument with a warped neck that affected its intonation in ways that a trained musician would have found intolerable, and Chesney Senior was not a trained musician. He had learned to play it from someone, somewhere, in circumstances he never described, and what he had learned was not a formal technique or a repertoire, but a way of producing sound that expressed something he had no other means of expressing. He played chords primarily, sustained voicings that he moved through slowly, following some internal logic that had no relationship to any specific song or key. The playing was not impressive in any technical sense. It was simply consistent and, in its consistency, present in the Baker household with a reliability that nothing else was. Baker was 5 years old when he first understood that the guitar playing was something different from the other sounds the house produced. Not different in any way he could have articulated at 5, simply different in the way that certain things are immediately distinct from the background in which they exist, the way a specific quality of light is different from the general light of an ordinary afternoon. He began to position himself near the doorway between the rooms when his father played, not entering the kitchen but listening from the threshold, occupying the space between being present and not being noticed. His father never acknowledged these listening sessions. Whether he was aware of them was unclear. Chesney Senior was not a man whose awareness of his surroundings was reliably detectable. But he never sent Baker away, which was, in the economy of the Baker household, its own form of permission. As Baker grew older, the listening became more specific. By the time he was 8 or 9, he had begun to hear the guitar playing with the kind of detailed attention that required something more than passive reception. He was registering the specific chords his father used, the way certain voicings recurred, the particular progression that his father seemed to return to when the playing was going somewhere, rather than simply occupying time. He did not analyze this consciously or construct vocabulary for what he was hearing. But the information was going somewhere inside him, accumulating in the specific way that music accumulates in people for whom it is not entertainment but something closer to sustenance. Vera Baker, who observed both her husband and her son with the careful attention of a woman who had learned that observation was more useful than intervention, noticed the listening sessions and said nothing about them. She had her own relationship to her husband's guitar playing, a relationship of tolerance and mild comfort, the comfort of something predictable in a life that was not otherwise reliably predictable. She understood, without discussing it with anyone, that the playing and the drinking existed in some kind of balance for Chesney Senior, that the evenings when the guitar came out were better evenings, and that the correlation between the two was consistent enough to be meaningful, even if its meaning was not clear. Vera was 31 years old when Baker was 10, a woman who had spent her adult life managing a household whose resources were irregular and whose emotional climate was determined by forces she could not control. She had developed, in response to these conditions, a quality of steady, practical competence that the people of Yale recognized and respected. She was reliable. She showed up. She handled what needed to be handled without making it into something larger than it was. These were not small qualities in Yale, Oklahoma in 1939, and they were not small qualities in the Baker household, where they constituted the primary counterweight to everything that was unreliable and absent. What she did not fully understand, until it became visible, was the degree to which her son was not simply listening, but absorbing, taking in, with the kind of deep reception that precedes the formation of any conscious response, the specific quality of his father's relationship to music. Not the technical content of the playing, which was minimal, but the quality of what the playing did to his father, the way Chesney Senior, who was elsewhere in every other context, was present when he played. The way the guitar took him somewhere that the rest of the house could not follow. The way it organized, temporarily and incompletely but genuinely, the disorder that characterized everything else about him. The cornet arrived on the kitchen table when Baker was 13, and what happened after it arrived was less a decision than a recognition. Baker picking up the instrument the way you pick up something that has always been intended for your hands, with the specific certainty of fit that precedes any conscious evaluation of whether the fit is appropriate or achievable. He produced a sound that first evening that was not music, but was not random. It had direction. It was looking for something. His father, sitting at the other end of the table with his bourbon, looked up when Baker raised the cornet to his lips. He watched for a moment, not with the expression of someone assessing what they were hearing, but with the expression of someone recognizing something. Then he looked back down. That was the entire acknowledgement. It was also, in retrospect, more than Baker had expected and more than he received from his father about most things. Over the following months, as the cornet was replaced by a proper trumpet and Baker's playing began to develop from the instinctive but unformed production of the first attempts into something with more shape and direction, the guitar and the trumpet existed in the Baker household in a kind of parallel. Father and son did not play together. The thought apparently occurred to neither of them, or if it occurred, some understanding that it would not work prevented it from being proposed. But there were evenings when Baker practiced in the back bedroom while his father played in the kitchen, and the two sounds coexisted in the house with a quality that Vera Baker described many years later in the only interview she ever gave about her family as the closest to peace that she ever experienced in that house. She said, "They were both somewhere else. And when they were somewhere else, everything was quiet." There was one evening that Vera described in that interview in more detail than the others. She said it was a winter evening in 1942 or 1943. Baker would have been 13 or 14, and she had been washing dishes at the kitchen sink while Chesney Senior played his usual chords in the corner. Baker had been practicing in the back bedroom for an hour, the muffled sound of trumpet exercises coming through the wall. At some point, without transition or announcement, the exercises stopped, and Baker began to play something else. Not a scale or a study, but a song. Something Vera didn't recognize, played slowly and with a quality that made her stop washing and stand still at the sink. She said it sounded like the guitar in the other room sounded, like someone going somewhere. She said her husband stopped playing when he heard it. The kitchen was quiet. The back bedroom was quiet. And for maybe 30 seconds, with the echo of both sounds still in the air, the house was what it had never managed to be in any other combination of circumstances. Entirely still, entirely present, entirely itself. Baker left Yale at 17 for the Army and never returned in any sustained way, and his father continued to live in Yale until his death in the mid-1950s, continuing to drink and continuing to play guitar in the evenings with the consistency that had characterized his relationship to both for as long as Baker could remember. The two men saw each other perhaps 4 or 5 times in the years between Baker's enlistment and his father's death, brief visits, not particularly successful, the distance between them as present in person as it had always been across the rooms of the Yale house. On one of these visits, which took place in the summer of 1951, when Baker was 21 and already beginning to develop a reputation in the West Coast jazz scene, he arrived in Yale on a Tuesday afternoon and found his father on the back porch with the guitar. Chesney Senior looked older than Baker had expected. The drinking had accelerated the visible aging in the specific way that it does, the face carrying more weather than the calendar justified. He looked at Baker when Baker came around the corner of the house, nodded once, and kept playing. Baker sat on the porch steps and listened. They stayed that way for perhaps half an hour. Father playing, son listening, the same arrangement it had always been, the same distance operating in the same space. When Chesney Senior stopped, he put the guitar down and said, "I heard you're playing." Baker said, "Yes." His father said, "Making money at it?" Baker said, "Some." His father nodded. Then he went inside. That was the conversation. It was, in its way, more complete than most of the conversations they had managed across Baker's entire childhood. What Baker carried out of that house was not the relationship with his father, which had never developed into the kind of relationship that could be carried. What he carried was the thing he had learned from watching his father play. The understanding, absorbed before it could be articulated, that music was not a performance, but a destination, that you played not for the audience but for the going somewhere, that the value of the music was not in its reception by others, but in what it did to the person producing it, the specific quality of presence it created, the way it organized everything else into coherence for the duration of the playing. This understanding, which Baker had absorbed from his father's guitar playing before he had any framework to name it, became the foundational principle of everything he did musically for the rest of his life. Critics who described his playing as interior, as private, as communicating something that seemed to come from somewhere the listener was not supposed to be able to reach, they were describing the same quality that a 5-year-old had observed from the doorway between 2 rooms in Yale, Oklahoma, listening to a man who was somewhere else, even when he was right there, find the only place he was fully present. The quality was not teachable and was not transferable. It was not the product of training or technique or any of the formal processes by which musicians develop their craft. It was something that had been installed in Baker before he had any instrument, before he had any musical vocabulary, before he had any conscious understanding of what music was or what it was for. It was installed by a man who drank too much and said too little and played guitar in the evenings in a kitchen in Yale, Oklahoma, going somewhere that no one else in the house could follow. Baker followed him there the only way he could, with a trumpet, decades later, in rooms on 2 continents where audiences went quiet without understanding why. Chesney Senior died of complications related to his drinking in 1955, the year after Chet Baker Sings was released and the year that Baker's face appeared on magazine covers for the first time. Whether his father ever heard the recordings, whether the face on the magazine covers registered as the boy who had listened from doorways, was not something Baker discussed in any interview that survives. What he said, in the Paris hotel room conversation that produced the only extended account of his father that he ever gave, was this: "He played to go somewhere. I watched him do it every night, and I learned that that was what playing was for." He paused. Then he said, "I just found a better instrument for the trip." If the story of what Chet Baker learned from watching his father, and what a guitar in an Oklahoma kitchen had to do with the sound that would eventually stop rooms on 2 continents, stayed with you, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who understands that the most important things we inherit are not the things that are given to us deliberately, but the things we absorb from watching the people around us be most fully themselves. Have you ever understood something essential about a person only years after the moments that taught it to you? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to explore more stories about where the music began, before the recording studios, before the albums, in the ordinary rooms where extraordinary things were first heard.